Hello. Good evening, all. Thank you for coming, especially when exams are just around the corner. Tonight marks our final debate before the quiet period starts and the second last debate of the year. As we close off the year, I know you've already heard, but there are still tickets available to celebrate the union's garden party on the 18th of June. There'll be limitless food and drink, and the theme will be 90s nostalgia. Tickets are just £40 for members. We, of course, debated the subject of Ukraine last term, and whilst we are very lucky to have the opportunity to discuss these broader geopolitical concerns in a place such as this tonight, our thoughts remain with Ukraine. Tomorrow at 5 p.m, we will be hosting the Ukrainian ambassador for what will be a very poignant and important event. The debate tonight will run as normal, with a round of 10-minute paper speeches, followed by a round of 1 to 2 minute floor speeches, then another round of both, concluding with our closing paper speakers. Aside from floor speeches, members can get involved by interrupting a speaker at any time by saying, on that point or point of information, note that it's up to the speaker whether they take your point, and they can't take interruptions in the closing minute of their speech. Further information on how to get involved can be found on the back of your order paper. So without further ado, we'll start the debate with our first proposition speaker, Cindy Yu. Cindy is the broadcast editor of The Spectator and presenter of the renowned Chinese Whispers podcast. Brought up in Nanjing, she received her master's in Chinese studies from Oxford University and has written extensively on Chinese politics and its relationship with the wider world. Cindy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President, for inviting me to join this fascinating motion, and to all of you for coming along this evening. It is without doubt one of the most important questions that we in the West have to ask ourselves today. As the war in Ukraine rages on, it's important to say that I stand on the proposition side tonight, not because the threat from Russia is not real or serious. Clearly, it is. In invading the whole of Ukraine and heading straight for Kyiv, Putin has shocked some of the most seasoned Russia experts. His troops have possibly committed war crimes and certainly destroyed families, lives, and dreams. Those in countries like Poland, Czechia, and the Baltic states have been reminded of the horrors of Soviet imperialism and fairly worry that they may be next. But I'd like to paraphrase an analogy used by one American security expert. Russia can be seen as a hurricane, he said, whereas China is climate change. Like a hurricane, Russia has caused massive destruction and can cause more, not least given its possession of nuclear weapons. It has used chemical weapons on foreign soil, engages in massive cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. It seeks to utterly overturn international norms and rules. Like extreme weather events, Russia needs to be dealt with in the short term and with urgency. But much of this comes from the formerly great nation thrashing out in the twilight of its power. Compared with this hurricane, I believe that China has the potential to be a much greater systemic challenge. Unlike Russia, China is on the rise, so it should command more of our attention. If it wanted to, one day, China could seriously threaten the Western way of life as we enjoy it now. In the long term, Beijing is the one that will have more money and military might. It's also better at alliance building, pouring vast amounts of investments into the non-Western world and the Western world. And it is smart enough to try to change the international rules and norms that have thus far suited Western powers well. First, consider China's hard power. Russia's might looms large in our imagination, but when Ukrainian farmers can tow away invading tanks with their tractors, it's clear that Russia is no longer a great power. Russia's GDP is equivalent to that of one Chinese province. Provided that President Xi does not destroy the Chinese economy through zero COVID and his anti-market policies, which is a big if right now, China may overtake the US as the world's largest economy by the end of this decade. Last year, the Chinese military had 5 times the budget as the Russian. And China's economic growth is no longer based on its being a cheap factory of the world. In recent years, made in China has become less about plastic toys and cheap clothing, but more about smartphones, computers, and semiconductors. It's all part of a deliberate strategy from Beijing to move up the values chain and out of the middle income trap. In particular, I wanted to highlight one underreported area of Chinese tech prowess: renewables. I suspect not many of you know that China is the world's largest exporter of wind and solar energy, and it is also the world's largest investor in renewable energy, inside and outside of its borders. So it's all too easy to see China only as the world's largest polluter, while overlooking the next area of Chinese tech competition. By contrast, Russia's attempts at cutting back on fossil fuels have been well documented, most recently in the fantastic HBO miniseries Chernobyl. All this means that A, China has more money, and B, it is more integrated into the world, which means any decoupling or sanctions against China in the style we've seen against Russia in the last few months will be even more painful. Should the Chinese government wish to leverage this hard power against the West, it would have much greater success than Russia has so far. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China is also building alliances across the world. Of course, Russia has its friends too. That much has been made clear through many African countries' ambivalence towards the Russian invasion, not to mention India and Israel. But the level of economic and technological support it can give these nations is not nearly the same as China's offering. The Belt and Road Initiative has invested $4 trillion across 68 countries, and through its vaccine diplomacy, China has led the world in vaccine exports in 2021. Crucially, in many of these areas, China does better than the West. Some leaders of the developing world talk about a colonial hangover that comes with Western aid, a condescending attitude dictating, absurd conditions like having transparency in investments and democratizing the local political system, whereas Beijing really couldn't care less. And it does feel like, despite chatter about global Britain, our relationship with non-Western and developing countries is too often an afterthought. During the pandemic, we hoarded vaccines, prioritizing giving boosters to our own people before many countries even had their first, leaving Western allies like Mexico turning to China for vaccine help. Though, of course, some of these recipients were less grateful after Sinovac's efficacy rates were revealed. China also has a different modus operandi on the world stage. It doesn't try to overturn international rules and norms, but it tries to mold and manipulate them to serve its own interests. So, whereas Moscow is the bull in the China shop, Beijing is more likely to set up its own vast dealership next door. But having said all this, I should stress that China is not inherently a threat. I wouldn't want you to leave today thinking that the People's Liberation Army is just around the corner, or that Chinese spies are at the heart of our dearest institutions. After all, until recently, Chinese spies' leading presence in Westminster was Barry Gardiner. All this is merely to point out the vastly superior potential of Beijing to wreak havoc compared to Moscow. We don't know yet that the Chinese Communist Party is out to end Western civilization. In fact, most Chinese theorists, including those close to the government, like the respected IR scholar Yuan Peng, believe the time of a single world superpower is over. America will no longer dominate, but China will not and cannot replace it. Rather, it will sit alongside Europe and other powerful actors, with each jostling for power. Of course, we are seeing a more assertive China under President Xi, a government that is treating its minority populations with shocking cruelty, that is threatening a democracy on its doorstep, that has dissolved one country, two systems when it comes to Hong Kong. But China is also an ancient country capable of rapid change. Its young people spend their time on Douyin and Xiaohongshu, like TikTok and Instagram. Its middle class buy Hermès and Chanel in Paris, at least before the pandemic. Today's China looks more like the West than the one that I was born into in the 1990s. And, go back a generation, my mother was born in the Cultural Revolution. And before that, my grandmother, born before the communist takeover. What will China look like in another 2-3 decades, the kind of timescale we're talking about for its power to mature? In the 60s, it was difficult to imagine rapprochement between Beijing and Washington. And yet, just a decade later, Nixon shook hands with Mao. The invasion of Ukraine has made clear that many in the West misunderstood Russia. If we think about the stakes involved, we must do better to understand China. I hope that some of you in this chamber will play a role in that. China demands our attention in a way that Russia cannot. Barring a giant misstep from its leaders, it will play an enormous role in shaping the future of the world. Russia simply couldn't, even if it tried.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Moving on to our first opposition speaker, Annette Ball. Annette is an Associate Fellow of Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House and has over 30 years' experience as an analyst of Russia and Central Asia, specializing in the domestic energy and foreign policies of the region. Annette, you have the ears of the House.
Madam President, members of the Union, ladies and gentlemen, fellow speakers, thank you for inviting me tonight. I'm delighted to participate in this important subject. In opposing this motion, this House believes Russia is a distraction. By way of introduction, I would like to cite just a few recent events. Sweden, a nation that has not been part of a war since 1814 and has avoided joining military alliances for more than 2 centuries, has formally announced its intention to join NATO. Finland, which shares a lengthy land border with Russia, has confirmed a similar intention. A new wave of famine has been sweeping some of the world's poorest countries as global food insecurity grows dramatically. Unprecedented economic sanctions and trade restrictions have caused prices of commodities to skyrocket. Oil and gas prices have reached their highest levels in nearly a decade, forcing many countries to reconsider their energy supplies. Germany is undergoing its Zeitenwende, or watershed moment. And for the first time in the history of the Federal Republic, Berlin is supplying a conflict region with lethal weapons. The Bundeswehr is being overhauled and modernized. And gone is the taboo surrounding military assertiveness that was the legacy of the defeat of the Third Reich. A Ryanair flight on its way from Athens to the Baltic state of Lithuania was forced to land in Belarus by security services. And in less than a single month, Ukraine was made the second largest country of origin for the global refugee population. Now, if I had predicted any of these events as little as a year ago, you might have dismissed me as an irrational thinker, or even as a madwoman. Yet every single one of the aforementioned developments has been instigated, either directly or indirectly, by Russia, a country whose label as a mere distraction from other geopolitical concerns we're debating this evening. A key problem in labeling Russia a distraction is that we are liable to fall into the trap of wishful thinking. And the narrative goes something like this. Russia is in a state of decline with a GDP that is about the size of Italy's. And so it will ultimately fade away and cease to be a problem for us, even if it is a challenge to us now. And it is this wishful thinking that engenders red herrings and black swans, such as, well, perhaps the West can drive a wedge between Russia and China, or Putin is terminally ill, and so will leave the political scene soon, and the leader who comes after him is likely to be more flexible and liberal anyway, and perhaps this new leadership will say, well, we actually want liberal democracy, and we've been wrong all these years, and in fact, we want to be just like you. And it is these red herrings and black swans that have littered the policy debate surrounding Russia for so many years that at the Russian Eurasia Program at Chatham House, we recently put out a publication with the express purpose of trying to debunk some of these more popular myths. Now, in arguing that Russia is not a distraction from more important concerns, I'll cite just 3 ways that its policies demand our immediate focus and which distinguish it from other contenders in the hypothetical league of authoritarian nations. First, the war has caused suffering way beyond the battlefield by exacerbating the food crisis in many countries in Africa and the Middle East that was already well underway owing to climate change, extreme weather events, and the pandemic. Ukraine and Russia together supply about 30% of the global wheat needs and are considered the grainiers of the world, and now the breadbasket is being bombed. Russia has severely curtailed its wheat exports, and Ukraine is no longer exporting. 70% of the world's cod and haddock comes from Russian trawlers. And while some restaurant owners in the UK fear that the price of a plate of fish and chips might reach 20 pounds, well, this is a first world problem. But, yes?
On the point of Ukraine and Russia contributing to a large amount of the world's wheat basket, countries that rely on Ukrainian wheat, for instance, such as Egypt, having their bread prices skyrocket. Is that not a threat? Is there not a threat for China, which already has massive investments in countries such as Egypt? For instance, it's put 10 billion into the Suez Canal region. Is that not more of an argument for China consolidating its foothold in these areas that are now entering a period of real crisis? Is that not?
I don't quite see it that way, because Ukraine and Russia will continue to be the world's granaries, and the inability to export this wheat to other parts of the world is something that we have to grapple with. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's not that China can take over becoming the world's breadbasket. So if I understood your point correctly, my point is that if we don't come to terms with the problem of Russia, we will continue to have this same problem. And as I was saying, while the price of fish and chips might hit 20 pounds in this country, that's a first world problem. But coming to what you were saying, the world's 45 least developed countries import a minimum of 1/3 of their wheat from Ukraine or Russia, including Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all countries suffering from hunger. Second, nuclear language has been coming fast and thick from Putin and members of his administration, albeit obliquely, as they play their foreign policy trump card. He referred to nuclear deterrence when he warned the West against intervening in Ukraine and then proceeded to move the country's nuclear forces to a special mode of combat duty. He recently test-launched the Satan II missile, considered to be Russia's most powerful ICBM. Now, it is true, most experts concur that the current conflict is unlikely to turn nuclear. But the possibility cannot be excluded, and there are problems that come with adopting an attitude of complacency towards the nuclear threat. Putin is unpredictable. Before the invasion, most experts believed that Moscow would confine its military action to the Donbass, rather than initiate a poorly planned blitzkrieg on 4 fronts simultaneously. And if we believed that Putin's disregard for human life was tempered by rational self-interest, after the 24th of February, we can no longer count on this. So what we are presented with is a leader of a major power, armed with nuclear weapons, who has very little to lose, given that for Putin and his armed circles, there is no greater catastrophe than Russia's fall from greatness, its perceived humiliation at the expansion of NATO, and a change in European security architecture that is exemplified by Ukraine's inexorable drift to the West. And as Putin sees that he is running out of time to bring Ukraine back into the fold of the greater Slavic motherland, he might well be inclined to take gambles that he wouldn't take otherwise. In addition, in the age of cyber attacks, a level of complication now exists whereby a cyber attack could interfere with the command and control of nuclear weapons. This would lead to close calls and decisions made under false assumptions. And the whole idea of non-proliferation has been imperiled by Russian actions. As the Russia expert Fiona Hill has pointed out, another dangerous byproduct of this Russian misadventure is that Putin has in essence encouraged non-nuclear countries to jump on the nuclear bandwagon so that they can engage in blackmail too. The idea being that if you have a nuclear weapon and you say you're prepared to use it, well, then not only can you have your way with your neighbor, but no one will engage in direct combat with you for doing so. Now, third, what about the scenario in which Russia ventures an attack on a NATO member state, such as Lithuania, who is currently providing refuge to both the Belarusian and the Alexei Navalny oppositions? This would invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, obliging NATO to go to war to defend it. So whatever views you might have about NATO, whether it be a force for evil or good or neither, if you do not want Article 5 triggered and to end up in the fray, then the Ukrainians are fighting for you too, and Russia is not just a distraction. By no means least, I urge you to consider the argument that by focusing on Russia, we concomitantly address many of the geopolitical concerns that you might have deemed to be of greater importance, such as climate change or the place of China in the global order. Now, in many ways, they are interconnected. In terms of climate change, through its warmongering, Russia has prompted Western countries not only to rethink their dependency on Russian fossil fuels, but also to accelerate the move to sustainable energy. For example, the German steel industry has pledged to move to green hydrogen from gas by 2030, and the EU legislation, expected before summer, calls for the total phasing out of Russian fossil fuels and includes initiatives for increased energy efficiency and the accelerated deployment of renewables. Now, it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a step in the right direction. And as far as China is concerned, as we've heard from our first speaker, Russia is a country in decline and so is ready to take risks. But China is much more risk-averse. Beijing has over $3 trillion in reserves placed in accounts and securities in the West and is included in very complicated supply chains. So what I'm trying to argue here is that China has risen and prospered within the current global order, and Beijing would like to reform it, but Moscow seeks to destroy it utterly. And without a strong Russia, it is much more difficult for Beijing to achieve its objectives. So in this respect, the China versus Russia dichotomy is a false one. Furthermore, it is not in Beijing's interest for Russia to fail in its current war, because according to Chinese logic, that would mean that America has gained a victory. But at the same time, China is much less likely to support a losing Russia rather than a victorious one. So crucially, a weakened Sino-Russian tandem increases the possibility of a return to a more stable competition among great powers, and this should really be our main objective. In conclusion, for those among us who would argue that the war in Ukraine justifies our focus on Russia, but only as an immediate threat in the short term, let me remind you that Russia has been fighting an armed conflict in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region for 8 years, that it already killed over 14,000 people before the current invasion. What we are witnessing now are troops bogged down in brutal and protracted fighting that could last for years. The Russian military is designed to fight long-term battles of attrition. We've seen this in Chechnya in the 1990s, in Syria, and since 2014 in Ukraine. And as Putin told the Valdai Discussion Club just last year, war does not stop. It just changes form. Naturally, leaderships have many concerns to deal with, and there will always be a problem of policy bandwidth. But a Russia armed with nuclear weapons and a gigantic chip on its shoulder is more likely to create chaos as it seeks to punch above its weight and engage in military adventurism than a China whose economy is fully integrated into the world economy and whose prosperity is fully dependent on functioning global supply chains. And if we have entered an age in which nuclear blackmail is now a thing, and there is greater insecurity in many of the world's poorest nations, and a growing refugee crisis as a direct result of Russian aggression, then I ask you, do we really have the luxury of placing a potential war between NATO and Russia fought in Europe in the category of distraction? The threat of such a war is more tangible than it has been in several decades. No serious observer of international affairs envisions a Russo-centric world emerging. But if there is one thing we have learned from Russian actions and policies over the years, one thing is that in certain circumstances, declining powers can pose greater challenges and dangers than rising ones. And so I urge you to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. I'll now take a round of floor speeches from the audience. These are 1 to 2 minute speeches in proposition, opposition, and abstention. So first of all, would anyone like to speak in proposition?
Hi, I'm Sal, and I'm at Homerton studying Chinese. Now, it's interesting to me that our speaker just here tried to imply that because China is economically integrated into the global market, etc., and therefore it has a stake in it, that it's somehow less likely to escalate and antagonize. But I would posit something different. The speaker here talked of humiliation, and some of my friends might know where I'm going with this. Let me make it very clear to you that the most important geopolitical priority and influencing factor for China, it's not economics, it's not power, it's not territory, it's not sovereignty, but it's this. It is the legacy of European imperialism in China, the 100 years in which Europe and Japan carved up China, killed hundreds of millions of Chinese people, men, women, and children. And especially sore is the Second World War, where Japan had a 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, rape all, and they committed numerous atrocities and biological warfare all throughout China. For China, this is the number one primary motivator. China is not a country ruled by merchants, as Britain was when we burnt down their summer palace, all in order to increase our own trade with them. The Chinese elite are extremely patriotic because they've been grown up in an environment of patriotic education. So if you're trying to rationalize what China is likely to do in terms of economics, you're sorely mistaken. Now, a lot of people in this room know me, and you might know that my mother is both Ukrainian and Chinese, and I have family in Ukraine right now who have had to flee from Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine because of Russian belligerence. More specifically, Russia destroying their apartment block. So it might surprise you that I'm in the proposition today. But the reason I am is because everything I learn about China, everything I learn in my course, points to the fact that it is so different in such basic levels, and we know nothing about it. We are basically poised for escalation and antagonization. Hopefully not resulting in war, but that's what I fear will happen. It's because I'll give you an illustratory example. I've told some people here tonight. According to UCAS, last year, out of 70 million people in our country, well, 68.5 million, only 390 enrolled in Chinese studies last year. 390. Let me remind you that this is the language probably the most different from European languages, the most divorced. There is no crossover. I mean, the number one thing my Chinese politics professor tells me is that you can imagine it like this. Russia and the West are 2 branches of the same tree, but China is a cactus. It's completely different, and we have no idea what's going on. And because they are so sensitive to European imperialism and the legacy of it, because they view everything we do that's remotely assertive as a direct affront to their identity and a continuation of our brutalist. Okay, go on.
Sal, I'll ask you not to take it just because it's gone over 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah. Because it is so likely that things escalate, because they view everything we do that's assertive as a direct provocation, because their GDP is 7.5 times more than Russia, because they've integrated our politics, because their military is so large, I think the long-term threat far outweighs anything Russia's doing right now. And I'm very sad to say that because of my personal situation, but that is what I do believe, and we have to look into the long term here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sal. Would anyone like to speak in opposition?
When I saw the motion on Facebook the other day, I asked myself a question. Distraction from what exactly? And I want to ask the chamber this today. What do we think is the real problem in this circumstance? And I think if we look into what's going on inside of Russia that pushed this country to this point, we would see that this is not a distraction. It's a prelude. Russia is not an exception. Now, personally, in terms of international politics, I am a firm believer that You can talk about history, culture, maybe something else, all you want, but at the end of the day, these things can be twisted at will through education, can be twisted through propaganda. As Putin's speech has made clear, the history can be distorted to an entire country through propaganda and information control. And if we look into the past 10 years about how Russia strangled its civil society, we would see that what determines international politics is not really history, not even really interest. At the end of the day, it's primarily about regime security more than anything else in a secretive country. And if we decide to see everything in that perspective, what we're seeing is not a distraction. Russia is not the first country to establish information control. It's not the only country that's preoccupied with regime security. It is not the only country in which voices are silenced, and it's not really the only country that's without democracy. And if that's news to you, I want to say, lucky you. At the end of the day, throughout history, we've seen again and again, a handful of cases, not even a handful, countless cases where a country embarked on war when regime security is being threatened, where nationalism is needed in order to muster up legitimacy for a falling regime. And I don't want to say, sorry, give me one sec. And I don't want to say this is a problem of democratization. This is not something that can be simply resolved by a regime change. This is not simply an issue of politics. As we can see, from the 90s onwards, there has been hope for democratization and a more peaceful world. This promise has largely not been fulfilled. And even within countries that professes to be democracies for hundreds of years, people are being disillusioned. This is not just a political problem. Now, I don't profess to be a Karl Marx and offering you a very comprehensive analysis of the exploitative effect of the international economic system. I don't think I can do that. What I can say, however, is that peace and personal rights and these things, maybe they have been something we hoped for everybody in this world 30, 20 years ago. I don't think that's the case anymore. Now, I hope I can be proved wrong. I really hope so. But as of now, what I think is that Russia is not a distraction from anything. It's a prelude, and it's a return of history when elements underlying fascist regime, extreme nationalist regimes, repeat again and again, not because of anything about culture or history, but because they return. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And would anyone like to speak in abstention? Actually, we'll keep this to 2 minutes.
Zachary Marsh, Robinson College. I just think that one of the things that has been perhaps missing in this debate so far is that it feels a little bit outdated. It feels about roughly where we were 5 years ago, when there was still a sense that perhaps Britain's closer relationship with China was an economically sound thing, that perhaps Russia was slowly drifting off into obscurity, the idea that we had no sense that these countries could pose threats to us at all. And I think we can all agree on this side of the House tonight that we do consider both countries to present concerns or threats to us. That in fact both nations are something that we should be alive to as a concern in our world that threaten Western values, and that's a positive thing. So perhaps I think it would be interesting to hear from both sides, rather than discussing whether they are in fact a threat, which I think we all broadly agree to, that there are concerning elements of what Russia is doing, there are concerning elements of what China is doing, but in what sense they are a distraction, and surely that needs to be measured more in what Britain's policy should be, rather than simply diagnosing them as something which is a threat to Western values, which I don't think anyone in this House tonight is really disputing. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move back to our paper speakers with Air Marshal Edward Stringer. Edward has served as Director General of Joint Force Development, Strategic Command in the British military and Assistant Chief of both the Air and Defence Staff. He joined the RAF in 1982 and has served in the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Edward, the floor is yours.
Madam President, thank you very much for a very kind intro, and what a humbling turnout tonight. Thank you all very much for coming. I think that was an excellent point. I hope to address it during my remarks. Because one way or another, Russia has been distracting me ever since I joined the Royal Air Force, as you've just heard, in the 1980s, and spent my first few years flying around the periphery of Cold War NATO at very high readiness to stop a Russian assault. Most of us, even then, thought that attack would probably never come. I knew the Moskva before she was the Moskva. She was then Soviet warship Slava. Odd now to think how much her advanced floating arsenal was feared. And then 1989 happened. The wall and the curtain crumbled. It seemed simultaneously both surprising but inevitable. And yet whole battalions of Western analysts had, only a year before, been predicting that Russia's autocratic command economy and ruthless military might would likely see it triumph over a decadent West. Folk trembled in front of the Russian bear. Maybe not all. Speaking a few years before he became president, Ronald Reagan, asked in 1977 about his strategy for the Cold War, said, "Here's my strategy on the Cold War. We win, they lose." The thought, the question that has stayed with me since 1989 is, how did this paranoid and fearful view come to grip the West, to become an article of faith that proved to this day to be so resilient? And it was well into the 90s before red-trousered brigadiers in the Ministry of Defense could be persuaded to stop spending money defending West Germany's Fulda Gap. And then eventually we stopped being distracted enough. Putin made clear his intent in the Munich Security Conference in 2007 in word, and a year later in Georgia in deed. And then a little later, 2014 happened, and once again, we were not distracted enough. On a personal note, at the start of that period, when as an RAF station commander I was awoken at 3 a.m. by my own quick reaction alert fighter jets getting airborne. The Foreign Office wouldn't even let us explain to the local press the reason for all this sudden noise, that the Russian Air Force was back over the North Sea with a vengeance, because we were in the middle, apparently, of a very successful reset with Russia. We were delusional for another decade, when a bit more distraction might have helped. And when I found myself that decade later as the MOD's operations officer, finally we did something sensible. We set up Operation Orbital in 2015 to help rebuild Ukraine's armed forces. But not everyone in the West was as usefully distracted as we were by Russia, as we are now finding out. So I'm sure at this stage you're wondering where my argument is going. It's that in all these examples, we have consistently appreciated the real security position too late. We have acted in lag of events. To use a pilot's term, we have not lead-turned them. We have always veered between under and over-appreciating the threat Russia poses, and now is not the time to repeat that error. Let us look at what we should be concentrating on, and it is, frankly, terrifying. 3 events face us. Each one would be epoch-defining in its own right. We are facing all 3 concurrently, and they are related. I can be brief because some of this has been covered already. The first, the global social economy is going through a once in 150 years industrial revolution, from the industrial to the information age, from a socio-economic model that is analog and oil-based to one that is digital and sustainable. Historically, powers that emerge in the van of every technological revolution dominate economically, then military, and finally politically. Which brings me to the second event, as has now been well trailed, China has anticipated this better than any other nation state and has had, for decades now, strategies in place to win this particular geostrategic competition, and it does see it as a competition. It wishes to regain its rightful state in setting the way the world works. We are only now, as a result largely of the pandemic, collectively in the West appreciating the extent of China's ambition and reach. This expansion of an ideological, economic, and military competitor to the West is a once in 500 years event. And as China burns coal to dominate green manufacturing and so the sustainable technology that the West requires, we are reminded of the third event, one that we have never faced before: climate change. So we simultaneously need to reimagine and rebuild, within a couple of decades, the entire petrochemical infrastructure that currently powers the world. We need to do so, as Nord Stream 2 reminds us, without the naivety over energy security that has left Germany, amongst others, in the position it now is with respect to Russia. And we need to do so while working out how to build global governance that admits a nation state, China, that it's in its view of the one-party surveillance state and its relationship to its citizenry is fundamentally at odds with the democratic traditions and norms that have increasingly animated global institutions over the last, arguably, half millennia, and especially so for us since 1945. However, some recent events provide, I hate to say it, but silver linings in what remain some very black clouds, chiefly the war in Ukraine and the latter stages of the COVID pandemic. Both are demonstrating to a world that had looked rather askance at Brexit and Trump that democracy might, after all, have some benefits. I shall leave for now what is happening in China and its major ports, as that has been well covered. All I'll say is everyone is now questioning the supply chains that start in China, and I think I would say being fully integrated into a global economy has never stopped countries fighting before. It's something we might discuss in debate afterwards. But let us, and me in closing, come full circle back to Russia, to Ukraine, and to a warship built there, the Moskva, the Slava of my youth, now, of course, a Black Sea war grave. And it is not a unique Russian military catastrophe, just the most potent symbol of a low-grade, corrupt, brutalizing Russian military operating under a malign, kleptocratic government. Remember our feelings back in 1989, our fears. Well, bringing that up to date, we had wondered, quite recently, if a weakened, a brain-dead, even a decadent NATO could resist the mighty Russian bear. It transpires that Ukraine, with a defence budget that is 1/10 that of the UK, 1% that of European NATO, and 1/3 of 1% of the combined NATO nation spend on defence of $1.2 trillion, that Ukraine has absorbed the entire might Russia can field, and in the battles of Kiev and Kharkiv, has now pushed Russia back. And to your point about the ability of Russia to grind as it did in Chechnya, I think what we're seeing now is Russia has deployed all the combat force it can, and under these sanctions, I don't think it can build another army anytime soon. And NATO is now resolute, and I assess more secure than it has been for many years. Of course, we must ensure that we continue to support Ukraine so that it may achieve a position of strength on the battlefield from which it calculates it can achieve an acceptable settlement with Russia, and to do so as quickly as possible for both moral reasons, law of armed conflict, etc., and also for the good points made on the other side of the aisle about the impact on global food supply, etc., etc. But we in the West must not repeat the errors of 1989. The Red Trouser Brigade is already back on manoeuvres, and this is perhaps the distraction that we were asked to define. The Red Trouser Brigade is already back on manoeuvres in the letters page of the Daily Telegraph, demanding more money for more tanks. And in strangely round figures, there's a political bidding war going on to say we should spend more on defence. 3% of GDP. No, 4%. But Western economies are not in good shape. Those three major events, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the rise of China, and climate change, are the security challenge of the age. There might be just enough money to deal with them if we spend wisely. Russia fooled itself in invading Ukraine and has revealed to the world its true nature. It is an urgent problem, but not amongst the most important ones. We must not be distracted from the genuinely existential security challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. We now hear from Ellie Breeze. Ellie is a first-year undergraduate student of HSBS at Peterhouse and the union's Equalities Officer-elect. She won the right to speak through open audition. Ellie, the floor is yours.
Right, I'm kicking it off for the student speakers, so I'll do my best for you guys. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the House, for coming out, especially during exam periods. I know I should probably be revising, but we'll talk about that later. To start off, before I get into my main point, the direction this debate has taken, I'm afraid to say that it's the way I expected it to go, but the way I did not want it to go. I fear this is becoming a dichotomous debate between China and Russia. Which one's worse? Which one's done the worst thing? We can sit here and trade barbs all night long about whether China's done worse things or whether Russia's done worse things. But I think, as has been stated by the abstention speaker, both aren't the best, to be completely honest with you. They've both done awful things, and both need to be held to account. But that's not a productive discussion, nor is that the discussion I wish to engage in this evening. Instead, tonight I want to stand here and argue that Russia's not a distraction, but it's a diagnostic. It's a diagnostic tool through which we can understand and view our international and domestic problems that we are facing here tonight. We've heard from the proposition and from indeed floor speeches about the prevalence of China and about the prevalence of climate change. I don't think anyone this evening would stand here and say that those aren't issues. They are. They're incredibly pressing issues. What I'm going to argue is that by paying close attention to Russia, by paying attention to how we have come to experience this with Russia, and by studying how we previously tried to deal with Russia and how we should henceforth deal with Russia in the future, we can in fact make a meaningful progressive change within our international and domestic systems through which we can then use to address the other issues we've heard here tonight. Dismissing Russia, banishing it to the back of our minds, is not the way we solve the issues facing our international system today. It sets a precedent through which we say if an issue is not the most important issue, we ought to disregard it. But in fact, by analysing these situations, by analysing them, even if they aren't the most pressing issue, we can set a precedent, we can shape our international institutions, our systems, and shape them in such a way that we can easily address issues in the future. I'm arguing long-term here. As we've heard, the importance of the long-term cannot be overstated. We need to think about the implications of this motion and the implications of passing or opposing this motion. In this speech, I will have two main arcs. First, I will discuss how we came to be here, our relationship with Russia, but most significantly, I want to talk about our institutions here in the West. I interpreted this motion to refer to the West when we're discussing who Russia is distracting. But first, how do we find ourselves in this situation with Russia? Well, as we've heard, and I'm sure many people here that do history could say a lot better than I can, the USSR, the end of communism, saw a complete upheaval of Russia and indeed other Soviet states. There was a massive social shift, and I am arguing there was a lack of adequate oversight and a lack of adequate accountability on behalf of Western countries to help shape this transition. We left Russia to the dogs. We allowed them to we forced them, sorry, I lost my train. We forced them to address their issues entirely by themselves. I'm arguing we did not take sufficient accountability as the West, as people that wanted this to occur. We did not assist and we did not help. This has led to the uneasiness, the oligarchy, the fractured nature of Russian society that we see today. Hence, the pull of strong men such as Putin. And I'd like to be clear here, I'm not saying Putin is the West's fault, not at all. I'm saying we played a role in it, and therefore we have a degree of accountability in responding to the situation we currently find ourselves in. There was a lack of oversight on the part of Western governments, and it is now our chance to rectify that. But moving away from Russia, talking more about Western institutions. Now, if you do HSPS, this is your Poll 2 revision, so you're welcome. Adam Branch would love this. Our international institutions, to put it quite frankly, aren't enough. They're failing. They're inadequate. They are not able to adequately address the issues of the 21st century, such as Russia, China, and climate change. Broadly, I'm not going to go into this too deeply because the third speaker is going to cover it much more comprehensively than I can. But we have an issue with regards to sovereignty in relation to international institutions. Broadly speaking, national sovereignty means that these international institutions, they can't encroach themselves onto us. They can't force us to do anything. And whether you think that is a good or bad thing, it is a weakness when it comes to dealing with international issues. There was an effort following the end of the Cold War to advance the liberal international order, to advance human rights, and to advance the ability of international institutions to tackle issues facing this. However, I'm now arguing that approach largely failed. It's not been successful. We haven't seen this degree of international accountability with respect to human rights, with respect to national governments, that perhaps was once foreseen. Climate change and China, we aren't taking a sufficient stand, and this is true of Russia as well. Our international institutions are ill-equipped and ill-able to address these issues, and this starts with Russia. If we stand here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and if we say that we should disregard Russia, pass it off as a distraction, what we are setting is an extremely dangerous precedent that I don't think is beneficial to the broader implications of our international institutions. However, I would like to stress that I believe this is changing. I believe we are starting to do the right thing. We are slowly shifting towards an adequate response and an adequate way of dealing with these institutions. For example, the European Union has taken several measures cutting off oil and gas of Russian exports, and I'd argue this is an incredibly important first step. However, such a first step, people may have backlash against and say that it's encroaching on Russia's national sovereignty. Indeed, if this was with any other nation, I fear we would be hearing this constantly in the news, that this is an encroachment on one's sovereignty. But the point I'm making here tonight is that if we blindly accept sovereignty above all, if we accept the mode of international institutions that we're experiencing currently, nothing is going to change. And this starts with Russia. This starts tonight in this chamber. If we oppose this motion, we're acknowledging that there's something wrong in the way that we have previously tackled international issues. And I do not believe that's a particularly controversial thing to say. We have failed. Western institutions have failed when it comes to dealing with conflicts. Afghanistan, Iraq, Bangladesh, countless conflicts we have not taken a stand on for various issues such as the culture within our international institutions. We have a chance here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, to make a stand against this and to change our institutions and to change our culture. Surely we all agree we want to tackle the big issues. Russia, China, climate change, whatever issue you think is important, it is, but it will not be solved by dismissing every other issue. Instead, we need to take advantage of the situation that's highlighted the failings of our Western institutions and really make a difference. I'm asking us here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, to do one simple thing: to oppose this motion and to change the way we view conflict for meaningful, progressive change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie. We'll now have our final round of floor speeches. Would anyone like to speak in proposition? Name and college, please, and please keep it shorter. Thanks.
No worries. My name is Naman Haftam. I'm at Wolfson College. The last speaker talked about who are we when we were talking this motion, and she focused on the West. In that context, perhaps one could understand this perspective, but I think we should take a global outlook. Why haven't most countries actually imposed sanctions? When you look at the countries that have actually imposed sanctions, they only represent 14% of the world's population. Now, the countries most affected by fuel prices, like we heard earlier, are not countries like the UK or my country of Sweden or Germany. They're countries like Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, precisely the countries that have refused to condemn Russia or even impose sanctions. Even allies of the West, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, they have not taken this position. So why is that? And we should reflect on that for a moment to say, is it a global concern if most of the world is not concerned? I think we should therefore vote for the proposition. Thank you.
Would anyone like to speak in opposition?
Thank you, Leslie. Max Ghosh, Trinity Hall. I auditioned to speak in this debate, but I promise I'll TLDR it for the full speech. Often the union in debating societies like this, we discuss and deliberate from the privilege of our leather benches and black ties. We speak of long-argued issues and often contested from the very founding of this free speech society. And I mean, while there are certain merits in those long-held debates, today with your vote, we can actually make a real impact in the here and now in a way which is twofold. The first is what voting in opposition will prove to the Russian government. Somewhere in the depths of a Russian embassy in London, the result of this motion will be telegraphed back to Moscow. It doesn't have to be an entire report. Maybe it'll be one short line at the end of a diplomatic cable by a junior attaché barely older than any of us. But trust me, it'll be there. And when I think of what I want that message to say, is that this chamber, the Cambridge Union, does not believe that Russia is distraction. That this student society and the students of this country will not be distracted from Vladimir Putin's criminality. That we will not be distracted from the butchering of Ukraine. The second is this. Tomorrow, this society has the great honor and privilege of welcoming Vadim Pristeko. Vadim is the Ukrainian ambassador to this country. Madam President, when you host Vadim tomorrow and explain to him what the Cambridge Union is all about, I desperately hope you tell him that we voted in opposition tonight. I desperately hope you tell him we stand in solidarity with Ukraine in their struggle for peace and independence. I desperately hope you tell him that this country is not and will never be distracted from some of the most barbaric crimes possible. And like the Russian embassy, I have no doubt a Ukrainian official in London, maybe the ambassador himself, will similarly pass on the message of solidarity back to Kyiv. Let us not make the mistake of the 1933 Oxford Union. The fact that one single debate result, Oxford affirming that their house would not fight for king and country, helped give Nazi party officials unreasonably high confidence in Britain's unwillingness to stand up for what is right, is a tragedy. This house has an opportunity to send a message that will once again cut through. Please don't waste it.
Thank you, Max. And would anyone like to speak in abstention? Name and college, please.
David Grace Maudlin. What I remember about China and Russia when I think about them is that both countries have been massively invaded in living memory, admittedly in the memory of people even older than me. But there are millions of people in those countries whose parents and grandparents lived through those invasions or possibly died during those invasions. This gives countries like that a very different feeling about security than those of us sitting in this chamber in this country, which hasn't been invaded for a very long time. So I think making those countries feel more secure is something we have forgotten to do, and we're paying the price for it. And the other thing that goes with that, Paddy Ashdown, who served in the British Embassy in Beijing, used to quote, very often actually, used to quote a Chinese proverb. And the proverb is, build golden bridges for your enemy to retreat over. In other words, make sure you give your enemies a way out, that they see there's an alternative to going on fighting, that there is something better they can do. And I think for those reasons about the security of those countries and the need to make violence not their best option, I'm going to abstain. Thank you.
As it's our last debate for a little while, I'll do another round of floor speeches. Would anyone like to speak in proposition?
Adam Chowdhury, Johns. So I think the problem with this debate is that a lot of the attention from opposition is that we need to think about Russia and we need to pay attention to them. But I don't think anyone in proposition thinks that we should just entirely disregard Russia. I think it's more about what's the opportunity cost of focusing on Russia this much, right? Can we maybe give more attention to other issues which aren't getting enough attention at the moment? And it is probably fair to say that maybe right now Russia might be getting a little bit too much media attention compared to other really important pressing issues at the moment. Maybe we need to focus more on international cooperation on climate change. Maybe we need to focus more on the crisis of democracy and the polarization of politics in America. Maybe we need to focus more about loads of different important geopolitical conflicts too, which are happening all over the world, which are getting pretty forgotten right now. So that's what I want to say is don't vote against the motion. Don't vote for the motion because you think that we aren't paying. We need to pay more attention to Russia, or we don't need to pay more attention to Russia. It's not about the fact that we're going to totally disregard Russia. We need to look at how we can best divvy up our time, political attention, our economic efforts, our political efforts, and right now, probably fair to say that there are things we need to focus on more. That's it.
Thank you. And would anyone like to speak in opposition of the motion? Name and college, please.
Oh, sorry. Thomas Bryan, Peterhouse. Distraction implies that something isn't a problem. And Russia is a problem in its own way. As much as it may currently appear to be in decline, this does not mean Russia will cease to be a problem. Russia has had many moments of decline in its history. It was occupied by the Mongols, and they had Kulikovo. They had the times of trouble, then they had the deluge. They had the Civil War, then they had the Great Patriotic War. Russia will almost certainly come back. Russia, for now, is in a weak position. Who knows where Russia will be in 40 years? China is probably more threatening, and it may well be in the long term, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to Russia. Russia won't go away. We must find a way in the West to live with Russia, or it will continue to be a problem. There are two paths. Well, there are many paths Russia can go down. It could go down the path of Dugin and Gumilev, or we could see a Russia which goes down the path of Tolstoy or Pasternak, two thinkers who prove that Russia has the capacity to be a peaceful nation whom we can rely on. To say Russia is a distraction would imply that we shouldn't keep trying to press for a Russia which is peaceful, a Russia which can live with the West, and a Russia we can rely on. It is a fairly imperative mission that we must seek this Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And finally, would anyone like to speak in abstention of the motion? We'll go here.
Jemima Barr, Sydney Sussex College. A lot of this debate has been spent trying to quantify the threats, and as the first speaker in abstention noted, there hasn't been as much focus on identifying what the distraction is. I argue that the distraction is that we are treating, or people are treating, all of the threats, all of which are significant, as separate. So China, Russia, climate change. They're all joined up. For example, just before the war in Ukraine. The Olympics happened, if anyone remembers, and Xi Jinping and Putin met in Beijing, one of the first in-person meetings that either leader had had, which is quite significant in terms of where both of them might be thinking. And they declared that the friendship between China and Russia had no limits. What does this mean in practice? Well, something that's slipped under the radar quite a lot is the fact that Russia and China have both been collaborating on essentially an alternative to GPS. The significance of this is that it's a purely military GPS system, which is therefore separate from their civilian structures. That is not something that the West has, and that may be pretty consequential if a large-scale war were to break out. On climate change, China, we all know, is one of the biggest emitters alongside the US. Both of those countries need to engage with each other to resolve this common problem. But also Russia needs to be on side because it's a country that will lose quite a lot by the fact that that it'll lose fuel, people buying gas, but also it stands to benefit quite a lot with more temperate climates in its north. So all of this is joined up. And so the distraction comes in, and this is why I'm arguing in abstention, when we try to debate one issue as being more threatening or more problematic than another, or trying to essentially say that, well, if we compartmentalize these issues and we solve one issue, then we can then go and deal with the other two or whatever. They're all joined up, and for that reason, we need to be thinking about integrated solutions to a myriad of problems rather than trying to compartmentalize them and think that we can solve them each one at a time.
Thank you very much. We now move to our closing paper speaker on proposition, Sam Bidwell. Sam is a third-year undergraduate student of law at Sydney Sussex College. He won the right to speak through open audition. Sam, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Madam President. In the depths of Soviet communism, the Russian people came up with the most wonderful coping strategy imaginable, which has come to be known as the Soviet joke. There's a wonderful story about a conversation between a Brit and a Russian, which I saw adapted to our modern day, and it goes a little something like this. The Brit says to the Russian, "The wonderful thing about British democracy is that I can walk up to number 10, go to Boris Johnson's desk, bang on that desk and say, 'Boris Johnson, I don't like the way you're running this country.' And the Russian says, 'Well, we can do that too. I can go right up to Vladimir Putin's desk, I can bang on it, and I can say, I don't like the way Boris Johnson is running his country.' And as fond as I am of that particular Cold War relic, there are other things from the Cold War that I think we ought to be more keen to jettison. And one of those is our view of Russia. Now, I understand in the short term why we talk about Russia as the most prescient threat, but those in this House who will tell you that because of Russia's immediate threat, it is not a distraction, are missing the point of this debate. The thing which unites the great foreign policy thinkers of our and any age, which unites Castlereagh and Metternich and Kissinger, is a view towards the long term, is a view towards accepting which problems might trouble us in the moment and dealing with them appropriately, but nevertheless accepting that they are a distraction from the big and existential challenges that we face. We talk about Russia in the same terms that we used to talk about the old USSR as this economically competitive, strategically intelligent force which had a competing vision of the world which can challenge or at least serve as an alternative to our own. In fact, modern Russia is a hollow state run by a shrinking and aging oligarchic class. When you account for the recent run of sanctions, it is 15th or 16th in terms of economies in the world, smaller than Spain or Mexico. We have seen in recent weeks and months that it is militarily and logistically inept. It has few allies and relatively little international reach. What it certainly lacks is a clear alternative vision to our own anybody who seeks to understand Russia must be aware that its lashing out comes from a position of deep geostrategic insecurity. But this debate isn't whether or not Russia is a paper tiger, as we have heard countless times. The debate is whether or not Russia is a distraction. And I would posit to you that there is a state which meets the criteria of an economically competitive, strategically intelligent state which poses a genuine threat by way of a competing vision to our own. And I'm sure nobody now will be surprised to hear that state is the People's Republic of China. We have seen in our own lifetimes the fact that Chinese goods reach across the world, whereas Russian goods barely go to the other side of their own country. We have seen through the Belt and Road Initiative a genuine expansion in Chinese economic, political, and strategic influence. We have seen them building their first military bases abroad ever, full stop. We have seen their co-option of organizations like the World Health Organization, to which they are now the largest donor. And what is most terrifying is that unlike Russia, China doesn't just seek to disrupt the international order, it seeks to replace it. It seeks to completely change the realities of our economic relationship with the rest of the world and to place itself at the center. Now, we've heard a great deal about this in broad terms. I'll give it to you in narrow terms. We talk in this country a great deal about the influence of Russian money. We see BBC articles condemning the government for their failure to address the presence and influence of Russian oligarchs. We hear that their children are at Nottingham or, God forbid, at Cambridge. Nevertheless, let's look at the facts. We give out more investor visas every year to nationals of the People's Republic of China than to Russia. More property in central London is owned by Chinese businesses than Russian businesses, and the same goes for individuals. Our research institutes, one of the few elite, serious, credible facts of hard power and indeed of soft power that we maintain over the rest of the world, like this very university and the other place which I shall not mention, have been co-opted by the Chinese government. We have the China Center here. We have proof of academics at Jesus College paid something to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds to publish research which confirms the line in terms of history, in terms of science, in terms of sociology of the Chinese Communist Party. We have seen that in our very own elite institutions. We have also seen our private schools, Westminster, others, take their skills, take their resources abroad to China and to try and set up shop over there. So all the while, whilst we're seeing these articles damning Boris Johnson for not condemning and not seizing the assets of the oligarch's daughter, who seems more interested in posting pictures to Instagram than in her degree, we have under our noses a growing, serious, threatening infrastructure of Chinese state influence in this country. I will take you now.
In terms of English investment abroad, well, I don't in Chinese schools. I don't. What's wrong with that necessarily? I'm one of those kids.
No, well, and I'm pleased to have you here. But nevertheless, I think it's concerning that institutions which were fostered in our political and social and economic environment, which is a political and social and economic environment which is broadly free and which speaks to what you might call British values, however you might construe those, I think it's worrying that the resources that they have wrought on the basis of that environment are being used elsewhere, when I know that British children in comprehensive schools such as mine would be absolutely willing and able and deserving of that access. I think it's a shame that so many of our elite institutions are willing to sell out and to forget the environment which gave them the ability to prosper in the way that they have. And as much as I don't begrudge access to education for anybody around the world, I think it's a great shame that this should happen in an environment which is in and of itself and inherently repressive. I would much rather that our resources, particularly as regards our institutions, be spent in environments where teachers and academics and professors can speak freely. I hope that answers your question. But ladies and gentlemen, it isn't just China. It's not just China, of course it isn't. In 20 to 30 years, we are all going to have to familiarize ourselves with Nigeria and Indonesia and India and Ethiopia. The challenges of 20 to 30 years' time are going to be unrecognizable to those of us in this chamber at the moment. And I feel that when it comes to Russia, what we see is not only a small economy relative to what it was in the 1960s or 70s, it's now 2/3 of our own, but a declining economy. Not just in terms of economics, but in terms of demographics, which nobody here has been willing to grapple with. We see an aging population beyond even the capabilities of our own, and a state which is completely unable to deal with it. We see decreasing yields in terms of mineral wealth and agricultural yield. We see a state which, because of its inability to embrace innovation by way of its authoritarianism, we have seen the declining ability for business and agriculture and technology and science to innovate. We see a stagnant country at best and a declining country at worst. I will take you.
On the demographics point, haven't the recent studies shown that China's population is now in decline? It's projected to decline in the future.
Well, one could look at a population of 1 billion, in which the population will, as per the projections of that own census, stabilize within the next 20 to 30 years. I would compare that to a population which, in most of the country outside of Moscow, looks to shrink between 20 and 30% in the next 20 to 30 years. I think there's a substantive difference there by way of scale, but I appreciate the point. And in this lies one of the ways that we can seriously combat China is by thinking about our own demographic challenges. But anyway, the point is this: we have heard climate change, we have heard about rising powers in the third world, we have heard about changes in the global economy. All of this precludes genuine Russian influence because of its declining economy, because of its inept military, because of its weakening demographic state. And I think if we continue to focus in on this Eurocentric Cold War view of the world, we will be completely unprepared to deal with what the next 20 to 30 years have in store for us. If you take one thing away from this evening, let it be this: we are in an existential conflict, both with ourselves and with the states which threaten the present international order. This is an international order which has been deeply, deeply imperfect, but which has guaranteed everybody in this room more safety, security, and prosperity than they would have had access to under the alternative systems which came before. There is no way that anybody in this room, however lucky they might have been, would have been quite so secure under a sort of Congress of Vienna system, dog-eat-dog, Hobbesian world. There is no way whatsoever. And that's what's under threat. And if we don't get serious about defending it, we will lose. Quite simply. What will losing look like? Well, it will look like the continued repression of national self-determination that we've seen in Xinjiang and Tibet, and also in China's immediate neighbors. It will look like economic reliance on a country which has made absolutely clear that it resents our role in its 19th century exploitation, and it will mean the dismantling of that system upon which we all rely. If you are somebody who feels secure and able and safe in traveling abroad, and this system collapses, tough luck. If you're somebody who hopes to do business abroad, tough luck. If you're somebody who hopes that they might start a family abroad, tough luck. That is the kind of system that China wants to present as an alternative, and it is a system at which China, the core of which would be a Chinese state willing and able to use its influence to undermine our national interests in pursuit of its own aims. We can refocus, ladies and gentlemen, but if we focus on this Cold War vision of Moscow and St. Petersburg, the future will be written in Beijing and Shanghai. And the fear of that is why I encourage everybody in this room to vote proposition tonight.
Thank you very much, Sam. Moving to our final paper speaker of the evening, Casper Nowak. Casper is a first-year undergraduate student of HSBS at St. John's College. He won the right to speak through open audition. Casper, you have the ears of the house.
Madam President, Union Committee, members of the Union, welcome. Thank you for sticking around. I wish that in this speech I could tell you a light-hearted story, crack a few jokes, and then be done with it. It's definitely the type of story that I prefer to hear when I'm sitting where you sit with a glass of wine, and it's definitely the type of story I prefer to tell. But the story I'll tell you is hard to hear, and it's hard to say, but it's necessary to be said and to be heard. And this story begins in Krakow, Poland, the biggest city in the south of Poland and my hometown. When I come back home for the term breaks, one of the places I'm most glad to see in the entire city is the train station, which I pass every time I come back home for the end of term. This is really a unique place for me, because there's always that kind of feeling of tranquility at a train station, as you see families reunite, young adults preparing for their rail journeys across Europe, couples kissing under the statue of the Golden Globe. It's really oniric. It's like a movie, basically. But when I came back home for the Easter break, this was not the familiar station that I saw, where families once reunited, parents confused were looking for shelter. Young adults were calling their family in the Donbass region, and they were trying to use the little Polish that they knew to get around the city. And where there was once tranquility and calmness, I saw discord, uncertainty, and fear. And when you go through a situation like that, through a dramatic situation, many thoughts come to your head. And many words came to my head when I walked among the Ukrainian refugees who sought shelter in the station. Thoughts about how they're all here because of a misguided vision of a mad ruler, because of a war that should have never happened. How in 2 weeks their lives changed from relative stability that we know of to refuge and fear. But when I walked through that station, there was one word that did not come to my mind. And that was that what I saw at that station was a distraction. I do not think any of us in this room understands exactly why Vladimir Putin decided to begin this scourge. I don't think any of us do want it. I do not think that any of us want to live in a world where a racketeer government can bully a European country into submitting to its will, not through words and diplomacy, but through bullets. But it is the world that we're living in now. And is it truly a distraction? The fire and terror of rising at this continent, just a couple thousand miles from here, over Kiev, over Lviv, over Mariupol, over Kharkiv, where a few months ago, people just like us danced at concerts, partied at clubs, studied in schools, and conversed in the streets, where people like that are now forced to abandon places they've lived in for decades in the name of a senseless war. Is that a distraction? And is it a distraction of what the Russian action says about sovereignty, how its vague claims about mystified conceptions of denazification and liberating Donetsk and Luhansk somehow ended up with the entire country aflame? The parody of the concept of sovereignty displayed on the entire world theater to see, is that a distraction? And is it a distraction that Russia rings the same bell it rang in Crimea in 2014 and Georgia in 2008? Is it a distraction that people are dying in the name of a senseless Russian vision? No, it isn't. It's not a distraction. Every person killed in Bucha, every building toppled in Kharkiv, every street shattered by shelling is a reminder, ladies and gentlemen. It is a reminder that destruction is never a distraction. It is never a distraction, regardless of who dishes out the violence. We should fight for a world where ideas and sovereignty are bulletproof. We should fight against the man with the gun, regardless of whether they are a Russian in Ukraine, Chinese in Xinjiang, or American in Abu Ghraib. And we should fight especially hard if that man tries to tell us what sovereignty is, what the future of Europe is, and what the future of the world is. When he tries to convince us that military force will create a brave new world. We should fight, but we should not ignore. We should consider it senseless, based on a dream of the great Soviet past that will never truly come back. We should consider it anachronistic and archaic, but we shouldn't consider it a distraction. Now, I wish to address two obvious counter-arguments which I expected to hear, and indeed did hear from the fantastic speakers in the proposition and the proposition speeches on the floor. And the first one is that Russia is like a blinding headlight. It might mislead us, make us concentrate on the wrong thing. What about the oppression of the Chinese Communist government? What about the treatment of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang? And even beyond China, what about Hong Kong, where one country, two systems collapses in front of our very eyes? These are all obviously fair points, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But what I want to argue is that the Western order is not like a train capable of going only in one direction. The liberal international order that we have built, as flawed as it may be, has been designed to rise over the bipolar system of the Cold War. We no longer live in 1960s or 70s where the fight for Western national identity and Western system of beliefs has a common and exposed enemy. Today, there is only one enemy, and that enemy is destruction. And I am far from believing that Asia is a continent devoid of destruction. But if we now allow tanks to tell us who is Russian and who is Ukrainian, perhaps tomorrow submarines will speak who is Chinese and who is Taiwanese. Yes, please.
Is there any qualitative difference between what's going on now and the violations of international law between Azerbaijan and Armenia last year, violations of international law in Yemen right now, violations of international law in Gaza right now? Why is this the only event that deserves to be not a distraction?
Thank you for that point, and it's a fantastic point, but it ties into what I'm saying, is that all these issues that you have mentioned, and countless others, which I don't have time to go through all of them, are equally important, and they all threaten sovereignty, they all threaten the ideals which we have built on national sovereignty. What I am saying is that Russia is par for the course in this, that it's not about saying, let's go attack China, and let's just ignore what Russia is doing because it's just a distraction. What I am saying is that we should treat this fight more seriously because it's closer than us, because it threatens sovereignty of a European country, and because it is par for the course for all the atrocities that have happened before. Now, where was I? Yes, please.
Why does the sovereignty of European countries demand more of our focus than the sovereignty of countries across the globe?
It does not inherently demand, thank you, it does not inherently demand more focus per se. Why the people in Europe right now should focus is that the fight is happening on their back door. I am not trying to get into a normative debate of which country's sovereignty is more important than others, because I believe that sovereignty of every country is important, and this is a complicated statement which I don't want to get more into. But what I am saying is that this is a fight on our doorstep. It is a fight of a country that has gone through the Glorious Revolution, the Maidan Revolution, a country that has strong pro-EU tendencies, and a country that is bordering many countries that have joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Therefore, the focus should also be there, and that's why Russia is not a distraction, as I've said. I will not be taking any more points of information, sorry. Where was I? Okay. The second counter-argument that I find valid, and the last one I will mention, is about our own identity. What about the destruction that we have brought? Specifically, what about the war on terror or the brutal legacy of colonialism? And it is true that the ideas of Guantanamo, the idea of white man's burden, Abu Ghraib and drone strikes show that the Occidental legacy is not anti-destructive either. But that doesn't mean that destruction cannot be our chief enemy today. We can recognize the danger of Russia's Ukrainian project while recognizing the faults in our own past. Perhaps this is the chief reason why we learn history. So here are my concluding remarks, but I'll take your point of information if it's still relevant.
Oh, yeah. Earlier in your speech, you argued that we can move past the Cold War, and therefore we shouldn't be evaluating things based on our interests or the country's ties to us, or
Yes.
things like that. We should be basing things solely on the norms of international law without reference to these more geostrategic imperatives. But then you just argued that we should not care so much about the sovereignty of Armenia compared about the sovereignty to Ukraine because it has ties to us and it's close to us and it's on our.
That's true. Thank you. Okay. So what I am saying is that sovereignty is important everywhere. We should fight for the sovereignty of every single country. And the establishment of the liberal international order and the neoconservative ideas of democratizing Afghanistan or countries like that is obviously violating this, this sovereignty. And I don't think, I personally, I'm going to stand in for it. But what I am saying is that this sovereignty of our nation here is based on proximity alone, that there's another layer to it than just fighting for sovereignty. It's the fight for the security of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or what have you. I might be biased here by being Polish, but just take whatever you want from it. I won't be taking any more points, sorry, because I have to conclude. So why do we learn history? We learn history to avoid the mistakes of the past. We learn history to detect when someone clings to it when approaching modern affairs. And this is exactly why, when I walked through the train station in Krakow, I did not see a distraction. I saw what other countries saw in Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, a threat to sovereignty right under our door, destruction which may turn the cogs of a future war. And this is why I am proud to say that Russia is not a distraction. This is why I am proud to say that you should consider what Russia's actions say about sovereignty and national independence when you walk through those doors. This is why I am proud to oppose the motion, and this is why I am proud to say, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Casper, and thank you everyone else for such a great debate. We'll miss these Thursday nights so much during the quiet period. In this house, we vote with our feet. Please go through the I door, the no door, or through the middle to abstain, and the results will be announced in the bar afterwards. Thanks. Bye.